So welcome to today's talk and panel discussion, Misconceiving Merit in Academia. I'm Becky Pettit. I'm pleased to serve as the Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I always enjoy the opportunity for us to get together and to participate in generative conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion. I want to thank my colleagues in the Center for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion for arranging this talk, and to Dr. Blair-Loy for her research, because it helps us to understand the nuances and subtleties of bias that can have cumulative and exponential consequences on careers in academia. How we define merit, excellence, and success in academia affects everyone in the pipeline, from admitting undergraduate and graduate students through faculty recruitment, review, and promotion. After today's event, I invite you to continue to engage in dialogue with your colleagues, especially those who are not here today, to explore ideas, beliefs, and values that implicitly perpetuate disparity. In a few moments, I'm going to introduce our speaker, who will talk about her latest book, Misconceiving Merit: Paradoxes of Excellence and Devotion in Academic Science and Engineering, which she co-authored with Dr. Erin Cech. After her talk, Associate Vice Chancellor Vic Ferreira will moderate a panel discussion reflecting on the talk and implications for UC San Diego. But first, I'd like to let you know how our questions will be addressed during the talk today. You will notice on your tables, you can use the QR codes. Using your phone, your tablet, or your laptop. If you scan the code or type in the link, you'll be able to submit your question online. Audience members will be able to look at the questions submitted and upvote the questions that they would like to have answered. The other option is to write your question on one of the index cards on the tables in front of you, and if you wave your hand, one of our team members will come by and grab that card from you. So without further ado, I will introduce our speaker and our colleague, Dr. Mary Blair-Loy. I feel so lucky to have you here at UC San Diego, and again, thank you for your scholarship and for agreeing to this talk today. Mary Blair-Loy is Professor of Sociology and co-director of the Center for Research on Gender in Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics, and Medicine at UC San Diego. She holds a BA and PhD from the University of Chicago and a Master of Divinity from Harvard University. Dr. Blair-Loy uses multiple methods to study gender, work, and family. Most scholarship emphasizes individuals' strategic trade-offs or implicit biases. In contrast, Dr. Blair-Loy analyzes shared normative cultural models of a worthwhile life. These cultural models include the work devotion schema, which defines professional work as a calling that penalizes involved caregiving, and the schema of scientific excellence, which defines scholarly excellence as measured by culturally masculine traits of individual apparent brilliance and assertive self-promotion. In her new book, Misconceiving Merit, again with Erin Cech, she uses multiple types of evidence to show that these cultural schemas are broadly embraced, yet can harm scientists and science. Dr. Blair-Loy has a number of accolades, recognitions, and honors to her credit. Please take a look at her full bio in our information to read that. But without further ado, I want to invite her to give her talk, which will be followed by the panel. Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor Becky Pettit, and I thank, as Becky did, our Center for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion, AVC Vic Ferreira, Director Mardestiny Perez, Wendy Van Dyne, and Julia Tai. I thank all of the participants in this research for their generous time and insights. Erin Cech and I have many colleagues across several universities that have offered insight and support to this work. And here from our own campus, I'd like to acknowledge Bob Bitmead, Marnie Brucolo, Bob Continetti, Jean Ferrante, Lisa Levin, Akos Ronatash, Sean Travers, and Edwina Welch. All errors are my own. And this research is supported by the National Science Foundation. Any views expressed today are those of the authors, not necessarily endorsed by the NSF. This afternoon, I would like us to consider a paradox. This research is on academic science, but I think there are many implications for the social sciences and even the humanities. The paradox is that academic science venerates meritocracy. The university is seen as a sacred space that can foster basic research, buffered from undue influence by profits or politics. STEM academics believe that they can objectively and fairly analyze scientific work. And many universities, including our own, have strong diversity and inclusion infrastructures for countering bad apples and unfair biases. Yet, nonetheless, an extensive literature documents ways in which women, some racial groups, and sexual minorities continually are underrepresented and feel devalued in their academic careers. So our questions this afternoon are, one, are outcomes for faculty actually that unequal? And two, if so, how can academic science, which so highly values meritocracy, continue to produce this inequality? As Becky mentioned, rather than examining individual bias, my focus is on the content of STEM professional culture and definitions of merit. A lot of great research studies implicit biases, which can seep in from the broader society, and most academic scientists would view that as bad, as distorting academic judgment. I'm focusing instead on revered features of STEM culture, which most academic scientists would embrace. My data come from a multi-layered case study of one R1 public university. And in many ways, this university is a best case scenario because it has multiple systems of checks and balances, a fairly transparent review system, publicly available salaries, and a strong EDI office. The research also is supported in analyses of Erin Cech's separate STEM inclusion survey data, which is a study of 7,000 STEM faculty nationwide and replicates the same basic quantitative findings. And then following this, we have a star-studded panel, and hopefully we can all together discuss how we can begin unwrapping cultural yardsticks of merit on our own campus. So the case study includes university personnel data on all STEM ladder-ranked professors, our own scholarly production index, which we put together from mining bibliographic and funding databases, our detailed survey, and in-depth interviews with 85 faculty. And we discover that there is a broadly shared hegemonic belief that the assessment of merit is fair. As a white man in our sample says, when we go to hire people into my department, the number one criterion is research excellence. The best person gets the job. A white woman says, engineers, being analytical and data-driven, will look at the CVs and pick the best candidate, regardless of ethnicity or gender. And a man of color reflects, I don't think we would even want to know in selecting a candidate, what they are demographically. We look for their qualities as a scientist first. We tend to be very objective. We don't say, oh, this is a paper by a bisexual. No one would even think about that. It's a biologist. In our survey, we also find that most believe that the university is fair and objective in promotions. From our bibliographic database, we documented that there is similar productivity among different demographic groups. In our study population, there are no mean demographic differences in the number, visibility, or impact of scholarly works, grant dollars, self-defined work dedication, and work hours, net of department and job level. Nonetheless, we find that women, mothers, minoritized men, and LGBTQ faculty fare worse than their white and Asian heterosexual male colleagues on average in terms of respect for their research, professional integration, and for mothers, salary. So our first question we've already answered. Great work. Are outcomes for faculty actually that unequal? Yes. So if so, how does this happen? Erin, Cech, and I analyze core features of STEM as cultural schemas. Psychologists sometimes talk about cognitive schemas, which help shape cognition. Cultural schemas are perhaps the source of cognitive schemas. They're historically rooted, taken for granted frameworks that provide not only cognitive categories, but also mental maps and emotional commitments. The first is the work devotion schema. This is a moralized cultural mandate that defines work as a calling. It includes intensive identification with one's discipline, undivided allegiance, and occasionally transcendent inspiration. And work devotion is seen as something good and something embraced by all demographic groups. A mathematician, and these names in the interview data, by the way, are all pseudonyms. A mathematician we call John says, "I can solve problems at all times. There is great pleasure in cutting through a mathematical problem and seeing the light." Yolanda says, "That's the love of science. It's not a big deal for me to work 365 days a year. It's what I want to do." And Francisco says, "My family has learned how to live with my work dedication. They're very good about it. The first question my daughter asks is, 'Are you busy now?' Like they know that I can just be sitting, but I could be thinking." And this devotion is not solely based on economic considerations. One representative quotation on this is someone who says, "I take work home with me all the time. I really love my work. I feel lucky. If I were independently wealthy, I'd be perfectly happy to pay for the opportunity to have this job. The part I like best is discovering things that no one on this planet knew before." So this is glorious. These folks, and I would put myself in this category as well, are very lucky to have these jobs. Yet work devotion has an ugly underbelly. And that is that motherhood is seen as particularly in violation of work devotion. Now recall that in our data, mothers' productivity is equal to others, but they are viewed as less productive, and some of them view themselves that way also. One respondent, this is a father who is married to another STEM professor, says, "It is really hard for new mothers to actually get back into science. Just the day-to-day aspects of keeping a lab going, keeping up with current discoveries, just thinking about science is very difficult." And motherhood is a pull, a distraction. It is viewed by our culture as another moral calling. Yet many faculty, for many reasons, are pulled away from, for perhaps a temporary period of time, from spending all of their time conducting basic research. And similar concerns about not really being able to do science are not voiced in our data regarding colleagues who reduce time because of consulting or starting a business or taking on a new administrative role on campus. One of our mothers in the sample is Shannon, who has, in her words, a stellar research career. And then she says, at nighttime, my kid's like, Mom, just lay with me before I go to sleep. I'm always anxious, and I'm like, I can't, I have work to do. I don't like to say that, and it stresses me out, and then they pick up on that. So motherhood is a pull, but so is her academic work. And she says, and then after the kids go to sleep, she works remotely with another colleague who also happens to be a mother well past midnight. Part of the underbelly of work devotion is that taking family leave is sometimes problematic. And some scholars, or some of the respondents rather, think that it is stigmatized. So one mother in our sample, speaking regarding a colleague, says, and I know that the chair and the department leadership were like, really? She's taking another leave again? And it did set a negative taste in people's mouths for a while. And about herself, she says, I have not personally taken any time off from my family, partly because I don't want to be perceived as one of the people who can't balance family and work. So mothers manage this stigma in various ways, trying to minimize their time away from public manifestation of their work devotion. They work until the birth and then quickly thereafter the birth. As one mom said, we survived, but it's very precious time when you have a baby. I feel like I got ripped off. Many mothers in our interview sample said that they took on a burden of passing or covering as someone who was not a invested caregiver. One example comes from a single mom of a child with special needs. Talking about when her daughter was very young, she says, it was insane. I never told them at work. I'd say, I have an off-campus appointment. I arranged my schedule around whatever was necessary on campus. I was always available. I never missed anything. She does this by supporting a secret army to help me with everything my daughter needs to allow me to go to work. She says, I just farmed out everything. I know people would say, I can't afford to do that. I couldn't afford not to do it. Recall that mothers look similar on average to fathers and non-parents in our study in terms of their time spent on research and their academic production. Yet this cultural condemnation of their supposed lack of work devotion shows up in their salaries. And in our data, we find that fathers are paid on average almost $4,000 a year more than mothers in annual salary in our study year, net of demographics, department, productivity, et cetera. So in addition to the schema of work devotion, Erin, Cech, and I also delineate the schema of scientific excellence, which is a picture of the characteristics and skills assumed to be markers of excellence in STEM. They serve as a cultural yardstick for measuring up the competence and worthiness of academic scientists. According to our interview data, the ideal is someone who has individual brilliance, somebody creative and groundbreaking. And in addition, our survey data shows that Other ideals are someone who is assertive, competitive, strong, and self-promoting. Less fully valued is someone with strong relational skills, and actively devalued are someone with public and evident concerns about diversity. So here's just a quick look at the items that go into our scale, in this case the assertive scale, where there's a stronger, people are more likely to strongly agree that these qualities are characteristics of a typical successful person in their discipline. The relational scale is also valued, but diversity promotion is devalued. And there is virtually no variation by subfield, here measured by different divisions, except that those in biological sciences are slightly more likely to not devalue diversity concerns. There's also very little variation by gender and by race ethnicity. I can talk more about this later if there's questions, but for now I'd like to point out that for the assertiveness scale, folks think that this is highly valued, and there's no difference between women and men in their self-conceptions of how assertive they think they are. Nonetheless, we might wonder if there are undeserved rewards for assertiveness, one of these highly valued traits in the schema of scientific excellence. So folks with self-conceptions of being more assertive also report receiving more respect for their research, and they also are paid more. Yet, STEM faculty with these characteristics are not more productive in terms of publication rates, impact factors, and grant success. In addition to this delineation of what are the valued traits of scientific excellence and how people view themselves, it's also important to note that how these markers of excellence are read by others matters, and that differs by the person's gender, race, and sexual identity. In our interview data, we heard how faculty valorize cowboys and rock stars, these individually brilliant scientists, but only white men received full credit for assertiveness. As one respondent said, so if you took a man and a woman and they have the same credentials, on this campus, if you're a woman, people would perceive you as not as excellent, partly because you don't look like you're excellent. Assertiveness turns out to be a particularly challenging balancing act for women of color. Assertive Black and Latinx women are more likely to face backlash. They're less likely than assertive white women to report that their work is respected. And less assertive Asian women face marginalization. They are less likely than less assertive white women to report that their work is respected. And these intersections of race and gender and how folks are viewed are consistent with other research. Recall that relational skills is a somewhat valued trait of excellence. It turns out, though, it's a double-edged sword. Men with strong relational skills in our data are more likely to feel respected by colleagues, whereas women with strong relational skills experience, on average, less respect. Recall that promoting diversity was seen as a devalued characteristic. And in our qualitative data, we show that this is because it's viewed often as a threat to excellence, as somehow smuggling in political or personal considerations that shouldn't be part of the conversation in evaluating somebody's excellence. It's really important, though, that although it was widely believed that the schema devalued promoting diversity, most of the faculty said that they did value for themselves, they saw themselves as someone who promotes diversity. So there is a gap, there's daylight between what they regard as the reigning set of ideals in their discipline and how they view themselves. And I think that that kind of daylight is something that holds promise for future transformation of the schema. We find that taking note of a scientist's identity can be seen as a threat to objectivity. And this is true for race and gender, and it's also true for sexuality. As one man says, I don't think of LGBT faculty as any different from the rest of us, and I don't think most others do too. But there are the LGBT people who are just out there in your face, like, hey, I'm gay, and you need to know this. And I really don't feel like I need to know this in a professional context. It's not an issue for me, but I don't need to be reminded of it every day. So we find more broadly that marginalized and minoritized faculty often feel that they're accompanied by a specter of diversity concerns. Just showing up and being present in their bodies seems to raise sometimes discomfort among majority colleagues. As one racial minority man says, people are insecure about what they think and they walk on eggshells because they don't want to say something wrong. Some majority faculty avoid or stumble through interactions with colleagues in ways that hurt informal mentoring or crowdsourcing of their junior colleagues' ideas. And this finding is consistent with other research on who receives the most informal mentoring. So although white men are often viewed as automatically as individual geniuses, they get the most support from others in the department. We find evidence of what Erin and I call the minority meritocracy trap. We heard variations of this when we asked colleagues to help us understand why the percentage of underrepresented minorities was so low in STEM fields at our university or in their units. And we heard them say things, if they're so good, why weren't they recruited to Stanford? And this assumption that racial minorities and women are less qualified, and they're only here because they got unfair advantages. And if they were really great, they would have been recruited elsewhere. So let's close our discussion about how this is possible by considering more broadly the ways in which these cultural schemas of merit are broadly embraced moral schemas. And they are wielded by many powerful and majority faculty. They are wielded in defense of the moral purity of academic science. As one very highly esteemed senior scholar says, we must require excellence. And once you've started hiring individuals that aren't excellent or promoting them, you've already damaged the department. And in kind of a catch-22, vocalizing concerns about inequality is viewed as illegitimate because it is allowing political and social concerns to pollute the purity of science. So, what would happen if we were to reconceive merit? Well, this could potentially be better for scientists and better for science. The work devotion schema, this manifestation of 24-hour allegiance to one's calling, leads to exhaustion, and other research has shown that exhaustion undermines creative thinking. People produce more innovative work and are more rested and when they have a life. People produce more innovative work when they're more rested and they have a life outside of work. Rather than assertive self-promotion, collegial collaboration should be more highly valued in an equitable way. So much of research is now produced by team science, and all members of the team should be valued. Demographically diverse and interdisciplinary teams produce more innovative work. Other research shows that diversity is an amplifier of innovation, not a threat. And so reconceiving merit would move academic STEM closer to excellence. So how do we get the word out? And some research has shown that when data on inequalities in STEM are presented by respected colleagues, then people are more likely to listen. So when this kind of information is presented by people like you, your colleagues are more likely to pay attention. So I think now we're ready to turn to our discussion with our panel. How do we unwarp these cultural yardsticks of merit here at UCSD? Thank you very much.